Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are really digging into some pretty explosive source material.
Yeah, it's quite something. We're looking at this claim that the Labor Party under Jeremy Corbyn somehow, imported and adopted Soviet anti-Semitism.
Right. A really serious charge.
Absolutely. And we're working from an analysis that pushes back hard against that idea, specifically responding to an opinion piece by Ben Cohen, who made the original claim.
So our mission here, for you listening, is to try and, cut through the noise.
Exactly. Figure out how history and maybe some historical myths get used into these political fights.
Okay, so the core tension we need to unpack, based on the material, is this whole Labor Party struggle really about genuine Jew hatred?
Or is it, as the rebuttal suggests, more about ideology, specifically about pushing back against criticism of the State of Israel?
Criticism that frames Israel as a, quote, colonial settler project involving ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Strong stuff.
Very strong. And that's the challenge, isn't it? Separating criticism of a state or an ideology like Zionism from actual hostility towards Jewish people.
So where do we start? The source takes us back to the beginning, right? To the Soviet Union itself.
Yeah, we have to. Cohen's argument apparently hinges on this idea that Soviet anti-Semitism was state policy, arguably from the 1917 revolution onwards.
Okay, that's a massive claim, historically speaking.
It is, and according to the analysis we're looking at, it simply does not stand the test of scrutiny, not for the early years anyway.
Why not? What's the counter evidence?
Well, just look at who was running things in the early Soviet state. You
Right.
had, a huge number of figures of Jewish origin in top positions.
Like who? Give us some names.
Obvious ones like Leon Trotsky, founder of the Red Army, Yakov Sverdlov, chairman of the Central Executive Committee, basically head of state.
Okay.
And then Zinoviev, Kamenev, Radek, Litvinov. These guys were central to the whole Bolshevik project. One historian said they were present wildly out of proportion to their size and the population.
Wow. And it wasn't just the political leadership, right? The source mentions the security forces, too.
Yes, this is really striking. The academic Yuri Sleskin points out that the NKVD, the secret police, forerunner to the KGB, he says it was one of the most Jewish of all Soviet institutions.
Seriously, the secret police.
Yeah. And think about the Cheka, the first secret police right after the revolution. Notorious for its brutality.
Right.
The historian Leonard Shapiro wrote that if you were arrested by the Cheka, you, quote, stood a very good chance of finding himself confronted with and possibly shot by a Jewish investigator.
That's quite an image, and that must have caused issues.
Absolutely. It created this really complex situation. On one hand, the revolution opened doors, abolished the Pale of Settlement, where Jews had been confined. Huge opportunities.
But on the other hand...
Well, that high visibility, especially in the government and the security forces, it definitely fueled resentment among some non-Jewish Russians and Ukrainians.
You can see how that would happen. People suffering under the new regime, seeing who's in charge.
Exactly. And we know this wasn't just isolated grumbling. The Soviet state itself intercepted letters, private mail saying things like, the Jewish dominance is absolute.
Or even that every child knows that the Soviet government is a Jewish government.
Right. That kind of sentiment was clearly out there.
So given that background resentment, what was the official line from the top? From Lenin, from Stalin in those early days? Did they encourage it?
No, quite the opposite initially. Lenin was very clear. He gave a famous speech in 1919 on anti-Jewish pogroms.
What did he say?
He basically told Russians to embrace Jews as our brothers and said anti-Semitism was a tool of the capitalists to divide the working class. The official policy was strongly anti-Semitism.
And Stalin. Because he's the one usually associated with Soviet persecution later on.
Well, early on, he actually doubled down on Lenin's position. In 1927, he launched a whole campaign against anti-Semitism, called it something that had to be combated with the utmost ruthlessness.
Ruthlessness? Like, how far did that go?
Pretty far. By 1931, he was publicly threatening active anti-Semites with the death penalty.
Wow.
And they even set up the Jewish Autonomous Oblast Birobizan out in the Far East in 1934. It was meant as a kind of Soviet alternative to Zionist Palestine.
So all this evidence seems to, contradict Cohen's claim about state anti-Semitism right from 1917.
It really does. The early Soviet state officially at least, was trying to protect Jews and stamp out anti-Semitism. The policy was anti-Semitism.
Which makes the later shift, the post-World War II stuff, even more jarring.
Exactly. And the source acknowledges that Cohen is on much firmer ground talking about the post-war years.
Yeah.
That's when you get the really nasty state-sponsored campaigns.
Like the anti-cosmopolitan campaign.
Yes, targeting Jewish intellectuals, writers, artists. And then the infamous doctors plot just before Stalin died.
That was the fabricated plot where Jewish doctors were accused of trying to poison Soviet leaders.
That's the one. Terrifying stuff. Clearly state-led persecution. But, and this is crucial, the source argues Cohen misses the why. Why did the USSR flip so dramatically?
Especially since they liberated Auschwitz. And they were the first country to officially recognize Israel in 1948. It's a huge turnaround.
It is. The analysis points to two big factors driving this change. First, internal Russian nationalism.
How did that play a role?
Well, World War II, the Great Patriotic War, as they called it, unleashed this massive wave of Russian national feeling. Afterwards, many ethnic Russians felt, underrepresented, maybe resentful.
Okay.
And this led to sort of hidden quotas, unofficial discrimination against Jews creeping back into key areas, the party, the army, trade unions, driven maybe more from below, but tolerated or even encouraged from the top.
So a kind of internal pressure building up. What was the second factor?
Geopolitics, specifically political Zionism and the state of Israel. Stalin had a major miscalculation there.
How so?
He initially supported Israel's creation. He thought, okay, here's a state led by labor Zionists, socialists basically. Maybe it'll be a friendly Soviet outpost in the Middle East.
But it didn't turn out that way.
Not at all. Israel quickly tilted towards the West, towards the U.S., and Stalin started to worry.
Worry about what?
About the loyalty of Soviet Jews. Would their allegiance shift towards this new, foreign, Western-aligned state? This fear of dual loyalty became a major driver of the persecution.
And we saw the real-world consequences. The source mentions specific victims.
Yeah, terrible examples. Solomon Mikkels, who led the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee during the war, was murdered in 1948, likely on Stalin's orders.
And Polina Zemchuzina,
Molotov's wife. Vyacheslav Molotov, the foreign minister. She was Jewish, and she was arrested and sent to a gulag. Can you imagine? The foreign minister's wife.
It shows how high up the paranoia went.
Definitely. But the source adds an important layer of nuance here.
Which is?
Jews weren't the only victims of Stalin's paranoia and persecution in this period. Not by a long shot. Think about the mass deportations of entire ethnic groups.
Right, like the Volga Germans, the Chechens, the Crimean Tatars.
Exactly. Millions were deported under brutal conditions. So while the anti-Jewish campaigns were horrific, they were part of a much broader pattern of Stalinist state terror targeting various nationalities.
And the source mentions a specific claim about a planned mass deportation of all Soviet Jews.
Yes, the idea that Stalin was planning to deport all Jews to Siberia just before he died, it became a big story during the Cold War.
But the source says?
It cites the historian Antonella Salomone, who included this was largely a myth, born out of the social hysteria of the time, and amplified later for Cold War propaganda purposes. Doesn't mean things weren't terrible, but that specific plot might not have been real.
Okay, that's important context. And the Cold War angle generally. Soviet support for Arab states against Israel. Was that purely anti-Jewish?
The source argues no, not purely. It was largely about geopolitics. Standard Cold War stuff. The U.S. backed Israel, so the Soviets backed Arab regimes and Palestinian groups. It was about combating American influence worldwide.
A global chess game.
Pretty much. And the source brings up this often forgotten episode. Israeli intelligence actually armed and trained some Mujahideen fighters against the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 80s.
Really?
Yeah, Hizb Islami. So the hostility definitely went both ways. It wasn't just one side's ideological hatred.
Okay. This sets the stage for the modern debate because often you hear this implication that left-wing thinking is somehow inherently or ineluctably anti-Jewish.
Right. And the source really pushes back on that by highlighting the deep historical connection between Judaism and the left. For a long time, the radical left heavily relied on Jewish thinkers and activists.
We touched on the early Bolsheviks, but it was broader than that.
Oh, much broader.
Yeah.
Remember Robert Service saying Jewish representation in Russian revolutionary parties was wildly out of proportion? That pattern held elsewhere, too.
Like Rosa Luxemburg in Germany.
A towering figure in European Marxism.
Yeah.
Or Emma Goldman in the U.S., the famous anarchist. Jewish women at the forefront of radical movements.
And this connection wasn't missed at the time, was it?
No, definitely not. People noticed. Winston Churchill wrote that famous article in 1920, Zionism versus Bolshevism. He framed it as a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people.
A choice between these two powerful, competing modern ideologies.
Exactly. And even some Jewish publications saw a link. The American Hebrew newspaper, also in 1920, called the Russian Revolution an achievement largely the outcome of Jewish thinking.
And there was that Rabbi Wanton quote from 1939.
The communist soul is the soul of Judaism. I mean, you can't get much more direct than that, obviously controversial, but it shows how intertwined these ideas seem to some people then.
So why? Why was there such an attraction, particularly to Marxism, for many Jews back then?
The source suggests a few key reasons. First, and maybe most obviously, Marxism offered a path to liberation from centuries of czarist oppression and anti-Semitism. Universalism over persecution.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, there might have been some cultural synergy. The emphasis in Marxism on studying texts, on deep intellectual debate, on, arguing about doctrine.
That echoed traditions within Judaism, like
Yeah.
Talmudic study.
Perhaps. Some argue that, yeah.
Yeah.
And third, maybe the most profound reason is this idea of a messianic impulse.
You mean like changing the world?
Exactly. The source connects it to the Jewish concept of tikkun olam.
Tikkun olam, repairing the world, making society more perfect.
Right. And Marxism, with its grand promise of a future utopian society, ending exploitation, creating universal justice, well, that resonated very deeply with that tradition of striving for a better world.
But that close relationship obviously didn't last, certainly not in the Soviet sphere. When did things start to fray?
It began pretty early within the Soviet Union itself, really with Stalin's rise to power. As he consolidated control, he systematically outmaneuvered and sidelined the old Jewish Bolsheviks.
Like Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, the ones we mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Karl Randick, another prominent Jewish Bolshevik who eventually fell victim to the purges, made this incredibly bleak joke.
What was it?
He said, Moses took the Jews out of Egypt, Stalin takes them out of the Communist Party.
Oof, that sums it up grimly.
It does. But the broader break, the sort of final severance of global Jewry from the radical left, that was a much longer process. It wasn't just Stalin.
What else drove it?
Several things converging over decades. The success of the Zionist project, the actual creation and then consolidation of the State of Israel, that provided a powerful alternative focus.
Especially after the Six-Day War in '67, that seemed like a major turning point.
Huge euphoria, huge surge in identification with Israel across the Jewish diaspora. Then you had the whole Refusnik movement in the USSR Jews fighting to emigrate, often to Israel, which became a major human rights cause in the West.
And that aligned more with Western anti-communism than the traditional left.
Often, yes.
Yeah.
And finally, the rise of neoconservatism is fascinating here.
And how so?
Many of the founding figures of neoconservatism in the U.S. were former leftists, often former anti-Stalinist Trotskyites, many of Jewish background. They made a decisive break with socialism and became staunch anti-communist and often strong supporters of Israel.
So a really complex, multi-decade realignment.
Absolutely. Which brings us back to the present day and how this history gets used or misused in the context of Corbyn and the Labour Party.
Right. The source argues that specific quotes from Corbyn were taken out of context to paint him as sympathetic to the Soviets, feeding this Soviet anti-Semitism narrative.
Exactly. It calls Cohen's use of these quotes symptomatic of a campaign geared to defame. Strong words.
Let's look at the first one. It was about nursery provision back in 1984. Corbyn apparently said the Soviet Union had far greater nursery provision than this country.
Yeah. And if you just hear that snippet, it sounds like, well, he's praising the Soviet system over the British one.
But the context was different.
Completely different, according to the source. He was speaking in Parliament during a debate about the Conservative government wanting to impose a tax on workplace nurseries.
A tax on children, as he apparently called it.
Right. He was expressing what the source calls widespread revulsion at the policy. And his comparison wasn't just to the Soviet Union.
What else did he say? This is the missing piece.
Yes. The Hansard record, the official transcript shows, he immediately went on to compare the UK's nursery provision unfavorably to other Western countries too, specifically mentioning West Germany.
Okay. So it wasn't the USSR is great. It was the UK is lagging behind lots of places, including the USSR and West Germany, on childcare.
Precisely. It was a critique of UK policy using international comparisons, not some specific endorsement of the Soviet model as a whole. The context changes everything.
Right. What about the second quote? This one was about Corbyn apparently not believing the Soviet Union ever intended to invade Western Europe.
Again, presented baldly. It sounds perhaps naive or like an apology for Soviet militarism.
But the source says his reasoning was ignored.
Yes. His stated reasons were, first, the absolutely staggering loss of Soviet life in World War II, over 20 million people dead. He argued that trauma made the idea of launching another massive invasion unthinkable for them.
A plausible argument, historically.
And second, he pointed to the nuclear deterrent, mutually assured destruction, or MAD.
The idea that any nuclear war would destroy both sides, so it prevents war.
Exactly. He was arguing that the nuclear standoff made a conventional Soviet invasion suicidal and therefore unlikely.
And the political climate when he said this.
He was speaking during periods where détente was policy, or later when Gorbachev was actively trying to end the Cold War and the arms race. So it was an assessment based on historical trauma and strategic reality, not necessarily ideological sympathy.
So if the historical claims about early Soviet anti-Semitism are shaky and these specific modern quotes were decontextualized,
then the argument presented in the source material becomes, what's really going on here? Is the campaign genuinely about Corbyn's supposed anti-Jewish sentiment?
or is it more about something else?
More about protecting the state of Israel from a certain type of political criticism, particularly from a potentially governing party in the UK.
This connects back to what you said earlier about Zionism. The source suggests anti-Zionism used to be quite common within the Jewish community itself.
Yeah, before Israel's establishment and consolidation, it wasn't the default position it often seems today. The source quotes some prominent figures.
Like Henry Morgenthau, senior American Jewish figure.
He called Zionism the most stupendous fallacy in Jewish history. Pretty strong.
And Edwin Samuel Montagu, a Jewish cabinet minister in Britain.
He called it a mischievous political creed. So, yeah, anti-Zionism wasn't always a fringe view within Jewry.
But things have changed. The source talks about the triumph of Zionism over Bolshevism.
Right. And the result, it argues, is that the political fate of Israel and the identity of many Jews worldwide have become deeply intertwined.
Which means
that criticism of Zionism as an ideology, or criticism of Israeli state policy, is now very easily, sometimes deliberately, conflated with an attack on Jewish people themselves.
And this is where that controversial IHRA definition of anti-Semitism comes in.
Exactly. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, especially the parts about delegitimizing Israel.
What's the issue with that, according to the source's critique?
The critics argue it creates a shield against legitimate historical and political analysis. If, as the source puts it, you understand that a fundamental aspect of Zionism was to expel Arab inhabitants in order to create a Jewish state.
Which is obviously a highly contested interpretation of history.
Highly contested, yes. But if that's your understanding of the history, then the idea that Israel's creation was not a racially motivated project becomes very hard to accept logically. The IHRA definition makes stating that view potentially anti-Semitic.
And modern Israeli law plays into this too.
The source points to the 2018 Basic Law, which declared Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people. Critics see this as Israel formally defining itself as, quote, a racialist ethno-state.
Prioritizing one ethnic group constitutionally.
Right. And when a state does that, criticizing that very definition or its consequences for minorities becomes incredibly fraught. Are you criticizing the state's policy, or are you attacking the identity group the state claims to represent?
It's a political minefield. So wrapping this all up, what's the ultimate conclusion drawn by the source material we've been dissecting?
The core argument is that the intense conflict around labor, particularly under Corbyn, wasn't primarily about tackling genuine anti-Jewish incidents, though those exist and are wrong. Instead, it was fundamentally about protecting Israel.
Protecting it from what?
From the sort of criticism never directed against it by a mainstream British political party that actually had a chance of winning power. A party that, if elected, would be more vigorous in holding the Israeli state to account.
So a preemptive strike, essentially, against a potential shift in UK foreign policy.
That's the argument being made, yes.
Right.
It forces you, the listener, to think about how these historical labels and affiliations, like that old complex link between Judaism and the left, get twisted and weaponized in today's politics.
And why understanding that history, the real history with all its contradictions, is so vital before you accept these kinds of accusations at face value.
Absolutely, because the risk is that legitimate political and historical debate gets shut down.
And that brings us back to the central challenge. Can we maintain the crucial distinction between criticizing a political ideology, Zionism in this case, and attacking a whole people? It's a distinction that seems increasingly difficult to uphold in practice.
It is. And when political actors actively work to blur that line for strategic advantage, it makes finding common ground or even just having an honest conversation almost impossible.